Hi, welcome to HowtoDandD. My name is Fred Wheeler and today I want to talk about Dungeons & Dragons because I always talk about Dungeons & Dragons. We could talk about Blue Dice of Doom, but no, that's not the topic for today. We're going to talk about the skill challenge mechanics in a Dungeons & Dragons 5e game. That's right. You've been looking for it. You want to know more? Let's talk about it today. I would like to say that I don't recommend just using the old Dungeons & Dragons 4e skill challenge mechanics and just transplanting them over to Dungeons & Dragons 5e. Why? There are lots of great things about skill challenges, but the 4e skill challenge had problems. And it is spelled out in the first Dungeon Master Guide that they put out, and they recovered the topic in the second Dungeon Master Guide. So that means we do actually need to do something with it to make it a little bit more useful to you. We can't just take what we have and use exactly the same thing. So how do we do that and make it work for you? So skill challenges are great for action-related encounters or scenarios. They aren't great for small battles. That's why we have a combat system in Dungeons & Dragons. They are good for large-scale battles. If you want to do a large-scale battle, you could use a skill challenge. They don't make great social encounters, and frankly, I don't believe they make great research projects as well. You know, if you want to use a skill challenge and have them research something, I think you can actually do that with a single dice roll. So in other words, not everything should be a skill challenge. So don't make everything a skill challenge because it doesn't need to be. Design your skill challenges with a series of narrative events or obstacles or scenes that your characters have to overcome. So something is going to happen at each stage in the sequence of the skill challenge. It is basically, think of it like an action scene in a movie. How do I make that work in my game? And then that's what you're going to do. You're going to break it up into steps and then work from there. You need to define clear goals for the entire skill challenge. So what is the overall goal of the skill challenge? And you also need to cover the consequences for success and failure at each stage of your skill challenge. So that means you need a clear goal for the skill challenge. You need a clear goal for each stage of your skill challenge. And you need to define what the success and failure at each stage and the overall aspect. So if we're riding down a lava river, the overall goal is to get from point A to point B without perishing and getting burnt alive. What are some of the steps that might take place? Well, maybe you have some lava bombs go off. Maybe there is a stream of lava that flows into the river you're running along, and that's actually going to push the raft or boat that you're on towards some sort of obstacle, like a rock that might knock you over. And with that'd be a bad thing to happen, right? So you need to deal with those aspects of your skill challenge. You need to explain to your players, because they will probably not do this, explain to your players they need to state the action their character makes. What is their character going to do? Don't let them just pick a skill check or an ability check and then roll it. That's not what you're trying to achieve. What you're trying to do is not break the narrative. That means you need to give them a narrative for them to be able to respond to the narrative. I know a lot of people say you should explain to players you're running a skill challenge, and that by doing that you now prep them so they understand what they're doing. I don't think you actually need to worry about that. You could if you wanted, if you felt that would help, but frankly, don't worry about telling people they are currently in a skill challenge, because really a skill challenge is loosely a collection of dice rolls or no dice rolls or actions that the player's character string together to achieve whatever the obstacle or challenge or hazard is. That's really what it is. I want you to involve everybody in the skill challenge, which is why I recommend using the group check system. Group checks for every stage of your skill challenge. Otherwise, what tends to happen is you'll get a few players, or maybe just one player, who's running a character with a very high skill modifier and they will dominate the entire skill challenge because they know they have a better chance of survival or success. And we don't want to necessarily do that. We're not trying to kill their characters, but we don't want to make it a, well, hang on, before we do the skill challenge, let's all look at our character sheet and figure out which skill modifier is the highest. Okay, now I need to make up something for the Dungeon Master that appeals to that particular skill, and now I can achieve or get a success on it because better chance of doing that if I have a high modifier. We're not trying to make it easy for the players, we're trying to make it exciting for the players. That's the goal behind this. And you will be surprised, players will metagame, they will do this. It happened in Dungeons & Dragons 4e, it'll happen in Dungeons & Dragons 5e. Therefore, you need to involve everybody. Otherwise, they rely on one individual to do pretty much everything, and we don't want that. Don't have long skill challenges. I can't state that enough. I know that the old Dungeons & Dragons 4e system had different complexities. You know, you could have a long skill challenge or a short skill challenge, but 3 or 4 group checks maximum. 3 or 4 stages or events or obstacles is more than enough. You don't need to do anything more with that. If you can come up with more stuff, that's great. But is it more interesting? Is it more exciting? Is it actually telling a better story? Or are you just making use of a system for the sake of making use of the system? Try to use different skills or abilities in your skill challenge. Now, when I say use different skills and abilities, that does not mean you have to avoid the same skill or ability check in a sequence if it makes sense to the story narrative or the scene narrative. So if it makes sense to have an athletics check at stage 1 and in stage 2, then so be it. If it makes sense that they need to make a dexterity saving throw at stage 1 and stage 2, so be it. I know Dungeons & Dragons 4e would state that you could not use the same skill a second time during a skill challenge. But if it makes sense to the narrative, that's fine, it's alright. You just don't want to do it too much. It's wise to allow a secondary skill challenge check or some other thing to be used during your skill challenge. Now, why do we do this? The idea of using a secondary skill is to gain advantage, so you have to roll 2 dice and take the highest result, or if you fail that secondary check, you might wind up with disadvantage using the Dungeons & Dragons 5e system. That means you roll 2 dice and you take the lowest result. You may decide you're going to apply a bonus or a penalty to the main group check. Now, the reason for the secondary check is to affect the main group check or the primary check for the skill challenge. Okay, that's what we're looking for. Now, why do we do this? We do this because, one, it allows us to include a wider range of potential skills and abilities, or particularly knowledge skills, in the skill challenge. So if you have a very high athletics, acrobatics, sleight of hand, stealth skill challenge, but you want the players who have characters who have knowledge in, say, nature, arcana, religion, history, to be able to have an effect on those different sequences, they might be able to do that by using a secondary skill check. And like I said, if they fail the secondary skill check, then use disadvantage or apply a penalty of -1 or -2 if you really want. If they are successful in the secondary skill check, then we'll apply advantage. So that's 2 dice, take the highest result, to the primary group check. Whoa, there's an awful lot to understand, isn't there? Events and obstacles that could end the skill challenge should be placed at the end of a skill challenge. Don't put them in the middle. So if the last event is the worm about to swallow the party, do not make it the second stage of your skill challenge. That should be the end of the skill challenge. Otherwise, guess what? Your skill challenge will end and the rest of it is a waste of time, and you spend a whole lot of time building something and creating something that you will never use. Arrange different consequences for failing a step in a skill challenge. and the overall skill challenge. It's important to look at consequences in terms of success and failure overall and for each stage in the skill challenge. So what can some of those failures be? These could be the loss of hit points, it could be the loss of hit dice, spell slots, maybe they gain a condition, wind up with exhaustion levels. You might decide that none of that really applies in this situation and it makes more sense to apply a story-related consequence. There's a story-related consequence here rather than something else. Now, I would like to point out that I've done a video with Wally DM that talks about the Indiana Jones boulder trap and how you can have different stages and the different sorts of consequences that can be applied. And that video actually details a couple of examples there, and I recommend checking it out. Don't get married to the concept that you must always be just reducing hit points, because it does not have to be done that way. You can use a lot of different things. If it makes sense, then do it. Don't be married to the skill challenge being failed overall with a set number of failed checks, even if this is the usual method, even if Dungeons & Dragons 4e made this the default system that it's actually built around. Now, why do we don't want to do that? Because you want to avoid breaking the narrative of an action scene or the skill challenge. If it breaks down the skill challenge narrative, then we don't want to do that. And I found this would happen to me when I was running Dungeons & Dragons 4e a number of times. And frankly, it's the worst thing because the players see through it, you see through it, and you feel like maybe I should never do this again. And we don't want to work with that. What's really important is not the overall failure of the skill challenge. Would you believe it? It's actually failure or consequences for failure at each stage of the skill challenge. That's why I stipulate using stages in your skill challenge. That's what will not break the narrative. But the overall can break it. So try to avoid it if you can. Okay, skill challenges don't have to include an ability check or a skill check necessarily. But this is the design default. Try saving throws. Try using an attack roll. I know we use that for combat, but sometimes it will make sense. And in fact, you may find in your skill challenge that whatever the player describes to you makes so much sense that there's no point rolling any dice. Yes, I just said there's no point rolling any dice. That can actually happen. You can find yourself in a situation where the task is so easy that there should be no dice roll. It's automatically successful. You may find that players provide you with an action they want to perform and it's literally impossible. So no dice roll is required because they can't possibly be successful. If players choose not to take part in a skill challenge, which can happen sometimes, I want you to count that as an automatic failure for the individual check and automatic failure towards the group check. Now with a group check, only half of the group have to be successful with the DC check. Okay, that's fine. But if somebody decides to opt out because they know they have a low skill modifier, and that's often why they do that, then I want you to count that as an automatic failure. Tell them so as well, so they understand what's going on, and so that the rest of the group understands how much they just made things so much harder for them. Now, classes, races, features around classes and features around your races, the use of spells, magic items, clever ideas, smart use of mundane equipment can result in automatic success or potentially replace a skill check you had planned for the individual and possibly the group check. So don't get married to just rolling that 20-sided dice. You don't always have to roll a dice. Sometimes you'll be using something else like some of the other tools the players have at their disposal. So be open to that. You'll be surprised it will make a huge difference to the kind of sequences and events that you can put together. I want you to be wary of players who try very hard to get success for the entire group check with a single dice roll using a high skill modifier for their character that they have. If you have a player who's sitting at the table and they know they have a +8 in stealth and the group check requires a stealth check, in this case, that seems to be the most sensible thing, is they have to sneak past some guards, then don't just allow them to roll the check for everybody, okay? That's not a good move. You'll find players will want to do that and they'll argue that point till they're blue in the face. It used to happen to me in Dungeons & Dragons 4E. It will probably happen to you. Don't fall for it and don't go for it. I want you to set your difficulty class or DC so it makes sense. If the character's doing something, what is the action the character is performing? Is it something that's very easy, medium, hard, very easy, nearly impossible? I want you to focus on what makes sense for the action the character is making. Don't focus on character level. Just because the level 1 does not mean you can't have a DC that's 25. It does mean that the chances are that almost everybody in the party will fail that check, but that's actually not the thing we're worrying about, okay? What we're worrying about is dealing with the other aspects to modifying a skill challenge to make it appropriate for their level, and we don't do it with DC, not in this case. Remember, Dungeons & Dragons 5e is about what makes sense in terms of what is easy, what is medium, what is hard, what is very hard. Those are the things we want to focus on. I do remember there being charts in Dungeons & Dragons 4e that would set out DCs that were appropriate for your level. But that's not something we need to deal with, because remember, bound accuracy does pretty much apply in Dungeons & Dragons 5e, and therefore stick with the narrative, stick with what makes sense. If you're worried about making sure it's fair for your players, that's what the last two aspects of the skill challenge is all about, not anything else. Okay, now you want to make sure your skill challenge is going to work for the party level. It doesn't matter what they are doing, because we can dial around damage. That's what we're going to use as our dial. So I want you to adjust the consequences of failure to reflect the party and the character's level. This is what we control, not difficulty class. It is always going to be around the consequences for failure. So how do we do this? We're going to use the damage, or should I say the trap damage severity by level table in the Dungeon Master's Guide on page 121. It actually sets out a different set of dice to roll for damage output. So between level 1 and 4, a setback would be 1d10 or a 10-sided dice. I would recommend to you, when you are setting out your skill challenge, that you do not use dangerous and deadly. I would recommend, because there's more than one stage. You're going to have between 3 and 4 stages to the skill challenge. That means that they can take damage a number of times. Use the setback. Okay, a level 1 character and you roll a 10-sided dice, that's quite a lot of damage. On average, they're going to take about 5.56 damage from the failure. Okay, so that's enough. I would recommend not rolling dice, because that's a variable. That still means there's a good chance you have less control of what's going to happen right throughout the entire skill challenge. Use average damage. Average damage is much, much safer. Okay, so even if we're using the setback damage for our character level, even if we're doing those sorts of things, how do we make sure that the skill challenge is appropriate for our party of players? Well, there's a nice way of dealing with this. I know it's going to make a few people seem a bit confused, but here we go. This is how it works. You know the skill challenge is too hard for your characters when one of the characters who has the least number of maximum hit points would die if they failed every stage of the skill challenge. So if the wizard has the least number of hit points, say they have 7 hit points at level 1, and they would die if they failed 4 stages of your skill challenge, then you know it's too hard. Okay? And that's using average damage. So you're going to use your average damage as a guide. So that means a level 1 character, a 1d10, let's say the average is 5. So a first level character might take, in the first stage, 5 hit points and only have 2 hit points left if they have 7 hit points in total. Second stage, they fail that, and now they're unconscious. They're not dead, they're dying, they're unconscious. Okay, we're all right. Third stage, if the third stage clicks on and they have no way of just, if they're not just stuck at stage 2 and they have to move to stage 3, well, 5 hit points of damage just means an automatic failure. 1. Same thing for stage 4. They're not dead though. There's time for things to happen, and give them time to make those things happen. Because during a skill challenge, people can cast healing spells. Why not? There's nowhere saying you can't cast spells that do other things in the middle of a skill challenge. Somebody can grab a potion and pour it down their throat. Somebody can drink a potion during a skill challenge. We don't need to take that away from them. You don't need to take that away from your players. You know why? What we're trying to do is make an exciting scene and action sequence and burn up resources. That's what we're trying to achieve. And if they are excited and they burn up resources and they had a good time, that's all we needed to worry about and nothing else. Okay, now that we've established how to figure out how to build a skill challenge, if this seems very complicated and complex, don't feel bad, because it is very complex and complicated. And I will make it clear, I will give you examples of how to do this in the future. That means future videos will give you a breakdown of how to build a skill challenge for a particular action sequence. And then all you need to do is throw in your dials. Remember, your dials are going to be trap damage severity by level. That's the thing that you put in there. And then how do you check it? Well, I just explained to you how to do that. So you should be fine now. All good, right? Now, if you want to check out more videos on this topic, I have a video on skill challenges and different ideas you could use in your game. I have an example skill challenge, which is being chased by a giant worm. You can also check out the Indiana Jones boulder trap, which is also a skill challenge and a trap at the same time. Wow, how did that happen? If you want to support the channel so I keep doing video content like this, you can do that by using my Patreon page, affiliate links to the book depository and Amazon. I have a merchandise shelf underneath my videos, or just watch my videos, that's fine. Make sure to share, like and subscribe, hit the bell button to be notified when I go live and when I publish new videos. And hey, till next time, keep rolling those 20s.